Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this policy exchange talk on levelling up in our rather, so far, slightly intermittent series on levelling up. We had Andy Haldane talking in the summer, giving us an overview of the subject. And tonight we have Paul Ormerod, who is talking about levelling up in one town, and that town is Rochdale. Paul is a well-known economist, author of, amongst other things, The Death of Economics and Why Most Things Fail. He also comes from Rochdale. He left when he was quite young, but he has returned to Rochdale to see what he can do to help the place, and he has, for the last year and a half, been chair of the Rochdale Development Agency. And he's going to, as I said, Andy Haldane gave us a kind of bird's eye view, and Paul is going to look at what is happening in one particular town, one borough of Greater Manchester. I should just say that our levelling up series of talks is going to become a bit less intermittent. We're aiming to have one every month for the next 6 or 7 months. We have, just to mark your card, we've got Alan Francis, who's the director of the FE College in Oldham, next door to Rochdale, talking about social mobility and levelling up. That was going to be in December, but I think it's probably now actually going to be in January. Amanda Spielman is going to talk about schools and levelling up. We've got Raghib Ali, who's going to talk about health and longevity and levelling up. Richard Jones, who's going to talk about innovation and research and levelling up. And I want to do one on the politics of levelling up too, with a as yet mystery speaker. Anyway, over to you, Paul. Paul's going to talk for about half an hour or so, and then we will have time for questions and comments from the very small and select audience here at Policy Exchange, and also for the many thousands of you out there who are tuned in. So over to you, Paul.
Well, thanks very much, David. And can I first of all say to people online, I'm having to use a rather primitive clicker. So if there are any problems, we can blame Policy Exchange. But so I want to start by giving some background. I'm hoping that the slides are meant to appear. So here's the first immediate problem. So yes, here's the overview of what I'm going to be talking about. So first of all, I'm going to be giving some background. But I'll be talking about the two key points, the two key strands in our policy. There are others, but these are the main two. And I think what we regard them as having the potential to be transformative for the borough. Because there's little point either in the levelling up policy in general or in the specific application to Rochdale. There's no point in carrying on just doing more of the same. And so we're building on two key comparative advantages of the town. So first of all, there is an existing importance of manufacturing in the local economies, not just in the borough of Rochdale, but in the surrounding boroughs such as Bury and Oldham and Thameside to the east of Greater Manchester. And we're also trying to build on and exploit the borough's proximity to central Manchester. And in essence, I'll be talking about our plans to develop a mega cluster of manufacturing innovation. And I'll be spending most of the time talking about this because it's a bit more complex to get across, but also the idea that residential policy is an industrial policy. I got into terrible trouble in the Manchester Evening News when I gave a talk for Policy Exchange at the Conservative Party conference and said we only wanted to build unaffordable homes. But I'll be coming on to that. I'll be coming on to that later on. But also running through this will be, if you like, two themes, in that most previous regional policy has essentially failed. I mean, governments over the past 50 or 60 years have spent billions and billions of pounds trying to raise up the regions of North Wales and parts of Scotland. And it's not been a complete waste of money, but it's made very little difference. And so maybe some ideas of why that might have been the case, that's a general consensus amongst economists, some idea why this might have been the case, but also importantly, why this time might be different. But just in terms of the background, first of all, just a few words, say what is the Rochdale Development Agency? It is a company, but it's one whose aims are to serve the public benefit rather than make private profit, and it's specifically the economic development arm of Rochdale Metropolitan Borough Council. It is wholly owned by the council. But perhaps to start off with, I can show, just for the benefit of people whose atlas is maybe rusting in the cupboard, if I can move on to the next slide, please. No response from this.
Oh, yeah,
oh no, it's got many places. Let's try again.
Does it seems to be freezing a bit.
Is there a map? Has there a map appeared? Oh, fantastic! It's not. I can't see it on this screen. It's not appeared on my screen. So, oh no, here we are. So here's Greater Manchester. Just a reminder, it's a borough of Greater Manchester, and Bury and Rochdale and Oldham are in the north of the borough. I think Greater Manchester, as part of the background, most of the legal powers within the city region rest with the individual boroughs. But the mayor and the combined authority have assumed rather formidable convening powers. And certainly it's my view that as an entity, the concept of Greater Manchester is working rather well. It's beginning to cohere and come together. I mean, just as an illustration of this, for example, in the local elections earlier in the year, there was a mayoral election in Manchester as well as local elections in the individual boroughs. And Andy Burnham literally won every single ward within Greater Manchester. And on the same day, across the conurbation, the Conservatives won quite a number of individual council seats quite easily. For example, in Rochdale itself, they have 3 wards which are really very safe for the Conservatives, and they won those. But those wards voted for Burnham in the mayoral election. Now, a key factor amongst these boroughs is they are poor. Even a cursory visit around the towns will reveal this. There are nice areas, but they are very poor. But politically, at the moment, of the 6 seats in these 3 boroughs, 3 are held by the Conservatives. So it's really very classic red wall territory. And so the poor places, despite decades of massive amounts of regional fund being spent of regional policy. They do need kickstarting by public funds. It's clear that there is a massive gap between the left behind towns, those that need levelling up, and the more dynamic sectors of the economy. And so it does need a kickstart by public funds, which of course what the government is trying to do. But it wasn't always poor. It wasn't always poor because these towns were where the Industrial Revolution first started in the late 18th century. And for a very considerable period of time, it was one of the richest towns in the whole world. I mean, obviously everybody was much poorer in the late 19th century, but in fact, it's relatively speaking. And a monument to that is the magnificent town hall. It's a Grade 1. I should say this is not typical weather for the borough, just in case anybody was beginning to wonder. It's a magnificent Gothic town hall, and it was built in the 1870s by non-conformist mill owners, and they were classic Manchester liberals. They really were complete free marketeers. They had bitter feuds with the parish church, which is cited on the hill above the town hall square, because that was connected to the state. And they built the town hall as a temple to free market capitalism. And when I say that, it literally was built as a temple because all the windows are stained glass. There is stained glass of the products that Rochdale trades in. There's stained glass of the towns and cities around the world that Rochdale trades with. And in the small council chamber, which is still used for council meetings, there are stained glass, a limited number of stained glass portraits of icons of English liberalism. And certainly in today's context, there's one that's particularly interesting, that there's an icon of Lord Mansfield, who, of course, in 1772 in the House of Lords, delivered his famous judgment that as soon as a slave set foot on British soil, he or she was automatically freed. So we can see that economic and social issues even then were really rather complicated, rather complex, that the mill owners were fanatical free marketeers, but at the same time, they were also fanatically concerned about the liberties of the English, as they would have seen it, or the British subject. And so they were strongly opposed to slavery. Now, moving on and getting on to the substance, David's mentioned on Andy Haldane's talk here at the end of June, and a key point that Andy made was that when we look at the distribution of incomes and productivity on a geographical level, to use a technical phrase, they are self-similar. The distribution looks very similar regardless of the scale. And on the next slide, I'm going to show here, I'm plotting the median gross weekly pay of residents. The median is the point at which 50% have more and 50% have less. It's slightly different. It's a different concept from the average. And so what I've done here, you might not be able to see the descriptions underneath. So I've taken the 9 English regions and I've added Wales to make it 10. I hope any Welsh listening or present don't mind me adding that to England to make it 10, because there are 10 Greater Manchester boroughs. So I've actually plotted the median income. I've done it for the 10 boroughs of Greater Manchester and the 9 English regions plus Wales. And this makes the point. You look at the distribution, and this is relative to the average across England and Wales, relative to the average across Greater Manchester. So the average in each is set at 1, but when we look at the distribution and we do that, they look the same. So there is this geographical self-similarity. And this implies there's an important policy implication for levelling up. And it gives some indication, perhaps, of why regional policy has failed in the past. That there is a pressing need to level up within regions, within city regions, rather than having a blanket policy of regional aid. We can see from this, the one chart, the most prosperous borough in Greater Manchester, Trafford, in the southwest. There's little point in giving more money to Trafford. There's no point having a blanket policy. There has to be levelling up on a place-based way within the city regions, and this will be far more effective. It needs specific place targeting. And I think in this sense, the government's policy is correct. It is very specific, very place-based. So much previous policy has been regional, not local, and it hasn't been particularly place-based. So there's an important policy implication. I think if we think back again to the first industrial revolution, this was essentially based upon two concepts. It was based upon new materials, the mass production of textiles, and it was based upon advances in precision machinery. The machinery of the time was more powerful and much more precise than almost anything that had gone before in world history. So it is this combination of materials and machinery which made the first industrial revolution. And that's part of our vision for the mega cluster of manufacturing innovation. We're saying what we want is, it's leveling up. Here we are, approach. We have materials machinery, and we're adding to it because there's already a very successful major government initiative on Made Smarter. So in a sense, we're trying to replicate what happened in the first industrial revolution for what we might call the fourth industrial revolution, and use high technology in terms of materials and in terms of machinery, in order to create a large mega cluster when these two things are complementary and combined. So that's our basic approach. Perhaps we might just first of all then just step back and remind ourselves why clusters matter, why it is important to cluster companies close together. I mean, Silicon Valley is an obvious example, but it's well known within economics and business studies that there are great advantages of companies being located close together. And in fact, why clusters matter, the original idea was put forward by Alfred Marshall, who developed the Faculty of Economics at Cambridge around 1900. And in the first edition of his book, Economic Principles, he spends quite considerable time talking about the benefits of clusters. And more famously, in more recent years, Michael Porter at Harvard, of course, has taken this concept further. So clusters do matter. And I'm just going to cite one example here. There was a major survey carried out by the European Commission in 2019, looking at over 2,000 locations within the European Union which had identifiable industrial clusters, where firms in the same industry, sometimes very narrowly defined, were clustered very close together. And they compared a number of outputs with firms which were not in the same industries, which were not located in a cluster. And they found almost universally, they found that there were higher wages, faster employment growth. There's a large number of benefits which arise from clusters. Again, these are comparing firms in the same industry not clustered with firms in firms which were clustered. And this was across a sample size of some 2,000 clusters. So that's why we're clustering these things together and why they matter and why we don't want to spread things out. We don't want to say we'll support this firm here and that firm there, which might be 3 miles away. We do want them locating very closely together, in the same way that we want to concentrate the materials and the machinery. In fact, David did come and pay a visit to Rochdale a couple of weeks ago, and I gave him a little tour of the town, and pointed out as a player one of the suburbs of the town. I mean, it's all gone now. It's all gone. But there used to be on one side of the main road a concentration of companies making machines to service the textile mills which were on the other side of the road. And that still lingered. That was still there until the 60s or 70s, or sometimes even in the 80s. That's gone. But that was the old technology. So we're trying to create this mega cluster. And just on that, we are making progress. It's not just a concept. We're starting to make progress. There's an advanced manufacturing initiative based on machinery, and we were allocated, well, we competed for and got £15 million from the government's Towns Fund. And the content of that, how we spend it, was up to the individual town. And whether you get it was decided by the government. But within Rochdale, we said, this is what we want to do. And a number of towns have done things like, doing up shopping centres. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, but it's not going to be transformative. And we said, no, we'll put our £50 million in to start to build a specialised building in the mega cluster, which will accommodate an institute of advanced machinery. The National Physical Laboratories are committing £23 million from which they won in a competitive bid for a fund called the Strengthening Places. That's not completely concentrated in Rochdale. It's spread out in neighbouring boroughs and across the border, if I may say. So in West Yorkshire, where we're very keen to develop links, we already have a number of companies signed up to this and collaborating with us. So we're operating on a cross-regional scale. And I think this is a key point, that these are very place-based submissions which were obtained, which were won in terms of a competitive bid. And it seems to me that this is crucial. And this is a big difference from most of the things that's gone before. That local places we can express, whether it's Rochdale or Rotherham or Gateshead or whatever, can express what they want to do. If they got this money, how would they use it within their towns? But then the central government decides, but it's very place-based and it's very competitive. Now, it doesn't mean that the areas which get the money are going to succeed, but it means that they are more likely. They put more thought into it and they run it through a competitive process. It's not a market, it's a government bid, but it is competitive and it's an evolutionary process. And I think there's another policy implication which comes from this, which might not be completely palatable to the government, in the sense it is an evolutionary process. So once some towns or boroughs start to get ahead, in this, my view, that they should be, in this first phase of levelling up, they should be reinforced, and that we should be trying to, rather than trying to lift, here's a long tail of low-performing boroughs, rather than trying in this first phase to lift everybody by a small amount, we should say the ones which have been successful in competitive bids, we should back them even more and try and lift some by a lot, rather than everybody by a small amount, because I think that's one of the reasons why regional policy in the past has failed. And if we're going to have a genuine place-based policy, this is an implication. It might be rather difficult for the politicians to explain this away, but if it's going to be successful, that's the logic of the position. And I was going to say, following from this, given that the Prime Minister has made it fashionable to quote Lenin, that we might say better, fewer, but better, which of course is, for those of you who follow these things as students, was a famous pamphlet written by Lenin, which I read at Cambridge many, many years ago, but that's why I'm aware of it. But you know, so I think that's an important implication of this policy. So in addition to that, I mentioned the machinery side, and that's making progress. And we're working with the Combined Authority of Greater Manchester and the University of Manchester developing the business case for investment in the advanced materials location. So the University of Manchester, for example, has done a couple of Nobel Prize winners for developing, you know, a completely novel material, graphene. So there are many advanced materials which can be used there. So we're really trying to propel the borough onto the forefront of technology in the same way that it was, you know, 200, 250 years ago during the first industrial revolution. And to base it, as that was, like I say again, on precision machinery and on materials. Now, an important point is that a number of local manufacturers positively want this to happen. Although I'm sure that none of them are trained as economists, but intuitively they see the benefits to them. They want more local competition. They want more firms which are operating at the frontier of technology. So they understand intuitively the benefits of clusters. Now, an important thing which we'll have to do is to diffuse the technology. So there are already a number of local firms operating at the frontier of technology. And our key task is to try to lift up other firms in the local area to start to get the gains of high technology. Now, it's a universal feature of industries that the distribution of productivity, again, is very skewed. You typically get a small number of firms with high productivity, and then there is a longer tail. And the difference in productivity, this is across industry and across countries. It's a very universal phenomenon. It's a great puzzle for economists. And so we're trying to lift up part of that long tail, again, rather than trying to lift the whole up. Now, one of the questions is, how can this survive? How can these firms the most productive in an industry can have productivity levels 3 or 4 times that of many in the poor performing long tail. How can they survive? Why are they not competed away? Now, my view on this, rapidly, I won't say very much about this because another thing I want to say, is that this takes us rapidly into, if you like, high economic theory. And it goes back, in fact, all the way. I mentioned Alfred Marshall earlier, who's a very accomplished mathematician. And his rival at Oxford at the time, Francis Edgeworth, also was a very accomplished mathematician. And it really rests on the question, I mean, this might seem very obscure, as to whether for a given level of supply and demand, there is a unique price, or whether there's a role for bargaining around it. I'm just really mentioning that, as I say, regrettably, given my own background, I think Edgeworth was correct on this. But I think there's also, if I can go from the realm of high theory to a more, if you like, more everyday observation, I think in the regions why a lot of these poor performing firms can survive is what I choose to call the good lad phenomenon. He's a good lad. It's a very cultural thing. It's a phrase you'll often hear said, especially if he's hard-working. And once somebody's deemed to be a good lad, even if he's actually completely useless, and no matter what misdemeanors he may commit, I suppose if he committed mass murder, he wouldn't be a good lad anymore. But short of that, so for example, if you're a football club and you've always bought your pies from somebody who's a good lad, then they might actually be terrible and full of gristle, but you'll continue to buy them, and it's very hard to shake off this label. But that's a cultural thing which I think really does have to change. I think just as on the concept of raising productivity and bringing high technology into the manufacturing area, I think a side benefit which is very important for boroughs like Rochdale is it will aid graduate retention. Graduates have a high propensity to continue to work in the area from which they graduate. Not always, but they're much more likely to stay in an area from which they graduated. And of course, in Rochdale, like many similar towns, we do have, well-educated young people. They go off to university and they don't come back. And one of the reasons is there aren't jobs for them to do. And if we can institute some high-paid, high-tech jobs in this mega cluster, it will be an important way to try and retain graduates. I should say, I think a key policy, which is not under our control, which is government policy, the government should be actively encouraging young people to attend local universities. For example, they might say start making them repay loans at much lower levels of earnings to act as a deterrent to incurring debt. So staying at home rather than travelling abroad. And this is in fact the norm in most European countries. In most European countries, people go to the local university. I mean, Britain is unusual in transporting large numbers of young people around the country, and it's very detrimental for people. It reduces our potential for areas like Rochdale. It reduces our capacity for our level of human capital. Well, that's quite a long discussion on around the manufacturing side. And I think let me move now to the residential policy. The residential policy as an industrial policy. And there's a very simple equation that more residents with high earnings equals more local jobs. If people are spending money in the borough, it creates the potential for restaurants, bars, dry cleaners, a whole range of jobs which wouldn't otherwise exist. So high-earning residents in the borough are a key part of having more local jobs. So it is an industrial policy. And we do have, I mean, much of the borough, the housing in the borough is very, very affordable. We have vast amounts of affordable housing. And going back to what I was saying at the beginning, we do want more housing which is judged to be unaffordable by many of the residents of the borough. We want to have homes that people want to move in because, as David will testify, I mean, it is surrounded, the borough is surrounded by open countryside. I'm not supposed to give a little plug here, but it's a much nicer place than many people's, if you like, perception might be without actually having seen it. So we do want to build more expensive housing, and for that reason we welcome ideas on the planning relaxation which the government has put forward, which has been actively opposed, obviously, by many areas in the south of England. But for this, there's a great benefit. We want to build these homes, and we don't want local groups campaigning against them to prevent us to building homes that people with high incomes may want to live in. But a central part of our policy is that we are only 15 minutes away by train. Rochdale is only 15 minutes away by train from central Manchester. Now, central Manchester itself has been transformed. It's a great success story of a place-based transformation, mainly carried out under the leadership of Sir Richard Leese, a long-standing leader of Manchester City Council, who's recently stood down, and Howard Bernstein, who was the chief executive for many years. But even in the mid-1990s, in the centre of Manchester, it was not possible to live there, even if you wanted to, because there was nowhere to live. There were virtually no private houses or apartments in the centre of Manchester. And now there are 80,000. 80,000 people live, mainly young people, live in the centre of Manchester. And so we're developing around Rochdale Station. We've just got a very large amount of money from the Strategic Transport Fund, but this is something which has been planned for a number of years, is to develop around the Rochdale Station partly residential, partly, if you like, flexible office, but mainly residential of apartments and houses which are expensive for the town. And say to people in central Manchester, look, you can get a nice place to live 15 minutes away from central Manchester for half the price that you're paying in central Manchester. That will make a big difference. And we have other plans for other developments. There are other stations in the borough where there are also proposed developments. They're not quite as advanced as the one around Rochdale Station itself, but that's a key part of our policy, is to bring in more expensive housing. And there will be benefits in terms of the income which the council gets from council tax. I've got a slide here because I also partly live in Richmond upon Thames. Let me just skip through these. No, sorry, I meant to go back. I'm struggling here. I'm going to go back. Yes, here we are. Here are the council tax bands in Rochdale and in Richmond upon Thames. And so I'll have to refer to my slides here because another disadvantage of the technology of policy exchange is the slides are too small for me to see, even with my glasses on. But we can see.
Slagging off policy exchange.
No, you've invited me.
We're giving you a platform.
Yes, I know. But I'm just making it clear. It's not my own technological background which is at fault here. But we can see here in Rochdale, council tax bands A and B. 70% of the housing stock are in A and B, whereas in Richmond 3%, and in G and H, the top two bands, only 1%. In fact, I think the leader of the council knows them all personally because they bring in a lot of money, you know exactly where they are. Whereas 20% in Richmond. A to D, we can see almost all the housing stock in the borough is in the lowest half of the council tax bands, and it's completely different in Richmond upon Thames. So that's why we see a residential policy, expensive residential policy as being an industrial policy. So basically, just to sum up, because I've now spoken for exactly half an hour, I think we need to have, this is a potential recipe for levelling up success. I think you do need to have a clear and ambitious vision. You know, you said we're trying to achieve something and we're trying to be ambitious, and this is what we want to do. It has to be clear and ambitious, not just more of the same. You have to have local political support, and at the RDA we're very grateful for the support not just of the political leadership of Rochdale, but for the for the mayor of Manchester for supporting these initiatives. It has to be place-based. and preferably building on existing strengths, which in our case are manufacturing and proximity to central Manchester, bottom-up support from existing companies. I say a number of high-tech manufacturing companies are very enthusiastic about having more of the same in the locality. Active collaboration, I haven't spoken a great deal about this, so I've hinted at it, between companies, local authorities and universities. And finally, I think the important point, developed by funds which are not doled out willy-nilly to anybody who wants them, but which are obtained by competitive bids and a process of, if you like, evolution. And these competitive bids, whether by accident or design, I think the government's policy has hit on something of a winner in this respect. So I'm finished on my talk now.
Good. And, well, that was really interesting. Thank you, Paul. But I should have made it clear at the beginning that people are invited to ask questions. I think it should be clear on your screens how to do that. So start thinking of the questions you want to ask if you're not here, and our select audience in the room might have questions too. But let me just pick you up on a couple of things. I mean, I think that was really interesting, both for what's happening in Rochdale itself at the moment, but also on what distinguishes this regional policy, this levelling up, this kind of new version of regional policy from its predecessors. However, my one note of scepticism that occurred to me while you were talking, that what you're essentially talking about is agglomeration theory. I mean, the kind of clustering idea, and you want to apply that to Rochdale. But we've sort of already had it in Greater Manchester, as you were saying yourself. And, you know, the centre of Manchester is unrecognisable from what it was 20 years ago. And the idea was that the benefits of that would somehow spill out to Bury and Oldham and Rochdale, but it hasn't, or not to a significant enough extent. So isn't there a sort of danger that you might succeed? I hope you do succeed with your kind of higher manufacturing cluster, but that it will kind of raise up Rochdale, as it were, but not have a kind of broader effect.
That's right. I mean, I did say that so public funds were necessary to kickstart these economies, and I did also go out of my way to say that in this first phase, not everything can be levelled up. But essentially, I mean, this is putting it deliberately, starkly, and simply. So simplification. You can try and say, okay, let's have a large pot of money and give it to everybody who's left behind, and then they're all a little bit better off. Or you can say, let's focus it and make it place-based, and then some places, if it works, will be a lot better off. And I think that's a much more effective strategy. So you're right. I mean, in the centre of Manchester, the area and Trafford around the airport, there are natural poles. So what we want to create, the public funds will start it off, and then it will be, if you like, a magnet, hopefully, for private capital. And so not everybody can be raised up at the same time. And I think the place-based, although the government may not find it palatable, but the implication of their policy being very place-based and being on competitive bids is you will try and raise up some, and in this way, and then the next wave. I don't expect to see major spillovers in that sense.
Yeah, I mean that creates a potential political problem for levelling up, done in the way that you've described it, in that that there will be, as indeed there already is. I mean, you said I was in Rochdale and Oldham a couple of weeks ago, and there was very much. Oldham has Rochdale envy, partly because Rochdale has already partially levelled up. I mean, the centre of Rochdale is also unrecognisable from what it was 10 years ago. Admittedly, if you go, a few hundred yards from that impressive new centre, it looks very much like the old Rochdale. But won't there be political resistance to sort of such uneven development?
Well, of course. I mean, that's always possible. Yeah. But I think what I'm saying, if you like, analytically, that if that is the case, then we'll just end up with another repeat of the regional policies that essentially we've had for the last 50 or 60 years, which haven't really succeeded at all. That's why something different has to be done. So I appreciate there would be political
Anyway,
influence.
let me go to our audience. I've been asked to remind people to raise your virtual hand, not your real hand if you're in the room. But I'll come back to you in a moment. But we have the Bishop of Manchester, David Walker, who is in the virtual audience, and I think you want to make a contribution, Bishop.
Yes, thank you. If I may, I mean, Paul, you followed the Prime Minister in quoting from Lenin. Perhaps I'll follow him in referencing Peppa Pig, who famously says, "Mummy, can we play the game?" So what I want to ask is, can the faith groups in a town, who often include significant individuals, institutions, networks, can we play the game? Have we any role in shaping and delivering levelling up? Or are we still those adversaries we were to those Victorian ultra-liberals who built their town hall to rival religion? Do we need to exile God, to put it succinctly, in order to be successful with Mammon?
So you're saying, I mean, do religions have a place? That you're saying, do religions have a place to play in levelling up?
Yeah,
I'd say, well, God moves in a mysterious way, so the answer may be yes or it may be no. But that's a rather frivolous answer. It's not really fair. Yours is a serious question. I think the answer is yes, because I think an important. I've not talked about, if you like, the social fabric of these areas, and for example, in terms of within the poorer areas of these poor boroughs, there are. I know you're very interested in this, David. There are serious problems with family structures. And the essential breakdown of the nuclear family, and the support of religious leaders of all faiths in that will be very valuable in putting these things together. So in terms, if you like, the straight economics, I mean, the answer is no, but I think indirectly the answer is yes. There's quite a lot to learn from this.
Well, but I mean, these boroughs, I mean, Rochdale and Oldham, are also very ethnically segregated boroughs. You have very tightly clustered British Pakistani communities in certain specific regions of Rochdale. That is an obstacle to levelling up or not? I mean, a successfully levelled up area would presumably be quite good for relations.
Well, in fact, in some ways, it's a potential benefit because one of the groups where, because of their emphasis on the family, one of the groups where young people, when they've graduated, do tend to stay, more likely to stay in the borough, are the Muslim groups. And so there's a lot of talent in the borough, particularly in that area. I would say, you're right, in terms of you drive around the town and there do seem to be quite strong residential segregation. But it is starting to end. I mean, it is gradually beginning to unfold in other affluent parts of the borough.
We have a. Just tell us who you are.
Thanks, David. It's Ruth Kelly here, and good to see you, Paul. And very interesting talk. I wanted to ask a little bit more about place and the size of places. In fact, I was very interested in the chart you showed of median incomes, and the fact that within regions you'll find a disparity which is very similar, that mirrors, as it were, national inequalities or distributions of median incomes. Is there a level at which that picture shifts that would naturally suggest the level at which perhaps government funding and support ought to be targeted, because there are clear areas that need, as it were, lifting up, subject to competitive bids, as you rightly say? So that's the first part of the question. The second is just to build on the conversation that you've just been having with the Bishop of Manchester. The social fabric. Now, clearly, as chair of the RDA, you're particularly interested in skills and productivity and income generation. But how important do you think the social fabric is to the well-being of people locally? I was very struck in that Andy Haldane discussion that there was an inverse relationship, which, you know, is slightly bizarre, between prosperity and well-being. And can social fabric actually be an important contributor to better well-being in a place?
Yeah, when London, the richest region in Britain, has the lowest levels of well-being.
Well, I think on the geographical one, obviously, they're both very good questions. I think obviously the more detailed you get, the harder it is to get reliable data. But certainly casual empiricism, well, almost any town that you go around in the UK, you know, within a town, there are, even in Richmond, there are areas which are relatively poor and others which are relatively rich. It's just at a different average level than, say, Rochdale. So there are areas there which are very desirable and seem, you know, rather affluent. And there are areas which are conspicuously poor. So even within towns, the distribution obtains. But I think there is in a sense, if you're trying to achieve something, it has to be on a sufficient scale. You know, so we can't just say, well, this street needs levelling up compared to the next street. You know, we have to do something on a sufficient scale. Well, the social fabric. I mean, one of the things that I'm actually interested in, and we are doing. I'm hoping to develop this further with the RDA because there are a number of pro bono non-executives on the board. Is to develop more pride in the town. There is a lot of residual pride in the town. That's definitely the case. But just to make people feel better about it. So, for example, for virtually no money at all, last year we held a competition. There's a big vacant end building in the town centre. And we said we've got a competition. People can send in composition, photographs or paintings of what Rochdale means to them. And it was tremendously popular. And that's all part of trying to, if you like, rebuild the social fabric. Now, it's not as obvious, and I'm sorry to the Bishop Manager, I was rather frivolous, but it's not as obvious, you know, what levers that you pull to do that. It's hard with economics, you know, you pull a lever and sometimes it doesn't work the way you think it does. But at least you've got some idea how it might do. But in developing the social fabric, it is much more experimental, and I'm sure on this, going back to the book I wrote some years ago, almost all these initiatives will fail. We'll just have to learn by experiment how we actually succeed in developing this. So on a small scale, we're very interested in developing this, in trying to promote the social fabric for relatively little expense, because the council hasn't got a lot of money. Its budgets have been are under pressure. So I'll have to think of innovative and inventive ways of trying to do that.
Let me go to the outside audience again. John Stern, visiting professor at City University. Are you there? Hello? Perhaps he's gone to make himself a cup of tea.
I'm trying to unmute myself.
Ah, there you are. Well done. You've managed it.
Right. No, I thought Paul's talk was very interesting, but I wanted to ask the question: how would you evaluate this? Because the relative pessimism over past regional policy has come out as a result of evaluations. So we need to know whether and how far this new approach is going to work. So what are the plans to try and sort out how far and what are the key factors in making it work?
Well, I think it's one of the things where if it works, it will be obvious. You know, it will be obvious. There are a lot of high-tech, high-paid jobs in the borough where there previously weren't. It will be obvious that there are many more or considerably more numbers of people with high incomes living in the borough. So it will be quite obvious in this particular case whether it's worked or not. So we don't need if you like, formal metrics, because I mean, we could readily design any form of metric. But I think that would be quite obvious. But going back to Ruth's point, it would be harder to design to define whether the social fabric has worked. Although we might, for example, we could track well-being. We could track well-being through people's interchanges on the internet and look at text analysis. Because I am also a visiting professor in the computer science department at University College London, so it's something I'm familiar with, and just throwing that out as an idea for tracking this sort of thing. But I think on the economic side, it will be obvious within Rochdale whether it's worked or not.
Of course, it's not actually just about what people in the town feel about it. It's also your kind of external image, and moving away from people. You know, at the moment, probably the dominant association with Rochdale, unless you remember the fact that it was the birth of the cooperative movement, is Rochdale grooming gangs. I mean, this is not a very positive image, and one of the sort of success stories will be when that is no longer the case. When people think of Rochdale in some other context.
Well, I'm glad you've got your dig back in, David, against it, because obviously we don't like to talk about that. We don't want to have repeated bad news. We are trying. You're right. We are trying to change the image of the borough for the better. And you're right. It will be self-reinforcing. That if it starts to prosper, the key thing. I mean, also going back to the previous question. I think another key indicator will be the extent to which, not just the volume of inward investment into the borough increases, but the nature of the inward investment. Because I should say, an important part of the RDA's work is there's a very extensive business park next to the M62 motorway, where there are huge warehouses, one of which is employing a distribution centre and will employ 3,000 people. But these are relatively low-skilled, relatively low-paid jobs, which is a very important part of our function, because at the moment, that is what many residents of the borough can do. And it's much better that they have these jobs. And so when the nature of the inward investment changes, we need those, but when we're also getting more high-tech, that will also be an indicator.
I mean, one thing, we've talked about this, but the question of sort of political, the politics of levelling up, essentially. I mean, how you kind of align political incentives. So you have, at least 3 levels of government that are relevant to you and to the whole levelling up process in Rochdale. And you've got the central government, you've got Greater Manchester, and you've got the borough. And obviously there are, and for the foreseeable future, probably different political parties in power, certainly at the central level in the Manchester and Rochdale level. I mean, how can you make sure everybody kind of marches, in lockstep, given that you have, there is a political incentive, you might say, for the National Labour Party for levelling up to fail. That isn't true, perhaps, for Andy Burnham, and isn't true for the Rochdale Borough Council. But do you see that as an issue or not? I mean, is this a...
Well, I mean, it's an open secret, isn't there? There have been tensions between Andy Burnham and government ministers, but I think that's always going to be the case, isn't it? I mean, even the tensions even especially between politicians of the same party, I would say, so that's always the case, and the politics can't be avoided. I mean, I think
you're very positive about Greater Manchester as a sort of convening body.
Yeah. I think it really. I mean, when it was set up, I was initially, really rather sceptical, but I think it's cohered rather well, and there is, an identity around that being developed. So, for example, I've heard from several young councillors. For example, in London, it's the London Borough of Camden, the London Borough of Richmond-upon-Thames. And a number of young councillors in the area, I've heard them say it won't be long before we're talking about the Manchester Borough of Rochdale, the Manchester Borough of Thameside, rather than, it's a long way away, and for some people that will never be the case. But that will be a much more effective branding strategy, certainly on an international scale, because people have heard of Manchester and haven't heard of Rochdale or Oldham or Bury.
Let's just do 2 final questions, perhaps. We've got going outside first, we've got Paul Wheeler, Director of Political Skills Forum.
Hi there. I don't know if you can hear me now.
Yep.
Yep.
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Paul. I'm a son of Berry, so I do, sort of admire what you've done. I suppose my question coming back to the political thing is, we've talked about social fabric and economic fabric. What about the political fabric in some of the boroughs now in North Manchester? It's beginning to fray. We're getting these really sort of hyper-localist parties in places like Failsworth and Radcliffe, who are basically saying no to everything. And in themselves are not important, but if a council tips into no overall control, they could stymie all of this imaginative recreation of the areas. I mean, how do political leaders locally deal with some of that, and particularly MPs?
No, I mean, it is a concern. So I think, for example, in the elections in May, the leader of Oldham Council lost his seat to an independent. And these campaigns are run very effectively through social media, through closed groups, and the most appalling things are said about people. And there's no real comeback, because unless you're invited to be in that group, you can't actually combat what's being said. You can only hear indirectly. I'm not saying this is true of everyone in the Greater Manchester area who gets elected as independent, but certainly this is it's an identifiable, and at the moment it's small scale, but it is a worrying trend. But that's more connected with the regulation of social media rather than anything that that we can directly influence.
Good, yeah, and Gerard, a final question.
Thank you. Jared Lyons, Economist. I'm also a senior fellow here at Policy Exchange. Thanks for a great talk, Paul. Implicit in your talk, apart from diffusion, was finance. And you were saying that the public sector will kickstart the necessary finance. But then you listed a whole host of public sector institutions that continue to finance Rochdale. Historically, regional policy failed for a whole host of regions. Inability of the centre to pick winners, but you seem to think you can do that locally. But also private sector finance never followed through. So what are the policy implications? Are you seeing the private sector finance kicking in now, or are you going to be demanding local taxation policy is it changed, and that Manchester or Greater Manchester and other areas can start to change the initiatives to attract?
Oh, well, I think in the first instance, I think in terms of the manufacturing initiative, we are actively trying to, we've all got a network of firms actively participating in it. We're trying to get support from major manufacturing firms to commit some resources. So we are looking for private finance for that. And you're right, ultimately without private finance, it won't work. The state can't continue to fund it forever. And after a period, that will have to be withdrawn. But I think my feeling will be that if an area is seen to beginning to develop and to bring in high technology, then it will become more attractive. Going back to your point about changing the image, it will become more attractive to private sector investment, which in many ways at the moment it's not attractive enough for the high-tech investment that we're looking for. But if we can demonstrate initial success and send that as a signal, then I think it will be. I think what I was keen to emphasise was that the towns that have been left behind are very far behind in a way which people in London and the South East don't quite appreciate. There are massive gaps, massive gulfs in whole swathes of northern towns, and the mining valley, ex-mining valleys of South Wales, for example, between that and, say, the towns of the southeast. There are poor areas in the southeast. And they're trapped in, if you like, an equilibrium of low productivity and low incomes. And it does need a boost. It needs a kick to take it off that. And there's no guarantee it will succeed. But if we leave it to, if you like, the workings of the free market, I'm afraid, the evidence is that's not going to do it. It will take, a very, very long time.
Well, perhaps a final question from me. You just prompted me in thinking. I mean, do you think that we, in the kind of national debate about levelling up, actually place too much emphasis on transport? Because it strikes me I mean, as you yourself said, I mean, Rochdale is 15 minutes from the centre of Manchester, which is a relatively dynamic area. Oldham has a tram, which is, 25 means you're always 25 minutes away from the centre of Manchester, and yet it has not had that. That has not acted as that sort of dynamic effect that I think some people imagine that.
Yeah,
trains and buses will.
I agree. I mean, there are things which are needed in transport, say in the Greater Manchester area, or more connectivity with the north. But these are much more about local. So, for example, in the borough of Rochdale, there's a town, Haywood, which has got 30,000 people, and it has no direct rail link to Manchester. And so what's needed is investment in much more specific local journeys, making them better. So for example, we are actively discussing a tram link to Haywood. That's going to take a long time. But say an express bus lane into the centre of Manchester, it's only 6 miles away. Something like that. It's these much more local connectivities where areas like Greater Manchester in the peripheral boroughs, where it's poor, and that's where the money, in my view, really needs to be concentrated. Rather in much more, grandiose schemes.
Good. Well, thank you very much to Paul. And as I said at the beginning, this is the second in a series, and the series is going to become a little bit more regular in the future. So watch this space for another 6 or 7 talks over the next 6 months or so. So it just remains for me to say thank you all out there for listening, and thank you for the very select group who are actually at Policy Exchange. And it's up to you to give a very big round of applause to Paul.